We're going to be talking with Jeremy Rifkin, and I'd like to read you, if I may, a little bit of Jeremy's bio. He is the author of the wonderful book, The Empathetic Civilization. We've featured it here on the Huffington Post, and let me read you a little bit about this really incredible man. Jeremy is the author of The Empathetic Civilization, The Race to Global Consciousness in a World in Crisis, published by Tarcher Penguin in January 2010. Mr. Rifkin has been an advisor to the European Union since 2002. He is also an advisor to heads of state, including Chancellor Angela Merkel of Germany and Prince Albert II of Monaco. In that capacity, he is the principal architect of the Third Industrial Revolution long-term economic sustainability plan to address the triple challenge of the global economic crisis, energy security, and climate change. Such a pleasure to be here with you. Your work is incredible. It took a lot of guts to write this book. I mean, not to mention a lot of time. But there are a lot of people who would say there is no saving this planet, and you give us a lot of hope. How did you come to write this book?
Well, this book actually was a long time in preparation. The actual book itself took about 6 years. But I began looking into this theme back about 25 years ago, but it didn't really gel in my mind until the last 5 or 6 years, but it was a long process. What we're finding is that babies are born, and from the get-go, they're wired for empathy, for attachment, for connection, for intimacy, for companionship. If those drives are not met in parenting and later in schooling and society, and they're thwarted and repressed and not flourishing, then the secondary drives come in with a vengeance, the aggression, the narcissism, the violence, etc. So, as you know in the book, and I spend quite a bit of time in the book talking about the shift in parenting over history, the shift in family relations over history, and that's the real politics. It starts with baby politics and toddler politics, and how we can mature empathy based on our cultural and institutional frames of reference. We can also repress it, and unfortunately, many of the institutions in our society today, including our educational institutions, are more likely to repress our empathic drive than to allow it to flourish.
Jeremy, we have a question, and it's a really interesting question, and I'm curious about this too. Empathic consciousness has to extend to all species in order to address extinction. Are you vegan?
I've been a vegetarian since 1977, which shows you how old I am. And my wife and I are very much involved in the animal rights movement. As you know, I spent a lot of time in this book, in The Empathic Civilization, on how our empathic sensibilities have increasingly stretched not only to include more of the human race as family, but also our fellow creatures as family. And I think we're very supportive of a younger generation who's beginning to understand that our fellow creatures have their own journey, as my wife says, on this planet. They have their right to flourish and be, and to have their moment on this planet.
I vividly recall the first Earth Day. Was that not an early, important day of empathy?
Absolutely. And you know, it's what just came to my mind just before Earth Day, when our Apollo spacecraft in 1969 took their last run across the dark side of the moon, and our young astronauts came out on the sun side and they saw the sun against the Earth. They took a few photographs of the Earth in color, and our whole generation put the Earth on the wall in posters. And it was an out-of-body experience. For the first time, human beings saw the planet in all of its beauty and fragility and vulnerability from the outside in. And of course, Earth Day happened really right after that event. Today, your youngsters, your teenagers at home, they do this every day with Google Maps. They're able to take these satellite maps and go from the outside in, from outer space, and then zero in maybe on a building 20,000 miles away and look in the door. So they're
Right.
actually changing their temporal spatial orientation to be able to look at the planet from the outside in, but also through the internet to be able to connect their central nervous system and embed it within the actual framework of this biosphere. So they're beginning to extend themselves, actually, their central nervous system, to envelop the planet in which they live. Now they have to create the rigorous empathic groundwork for an empathic civilization. That's what's not happening
When we
yet.
need to be a more empathic civilization, our leaders are really struggling. And I think a lot of it has to do with that 20th, 19th century kind of upbringing that they've all had. I was wondering, in your experience in working with world leaders who are really going to have to invigorate us and encourage us, what are you seeing in their skill levels,
Well,
empathy?
this is really interesting.
Thank you,
what
Tom.
mentioned, because Tom, there is a point here, and that is that a lot of times people that, and I don't want to overgeneralize, but people that move to these positions of political power are generally those who are working something out, if you know what I'm saying. And oftentimes it's because maybe they, and I don't want to be a psychoanalyst of political leaders, but oftentimes it's because they didn't get the attachment they needed when they were children and the appropriate empathic regard. That's not always the case. When I meet with heads of state, I'm very sensitive right off the bat to whether they really are mindful and attuned. I'll give you an example. President Zapatero in Spain. He was a political leader that very much interested me because his background was a philosophy professor. And I said to him the first time we met, and generally, you know, politicians, they give you 10, 15, 20 minutes in a first meeting. We sat down for a 2-hour leisurely discussion on philosophy, culture, history. And here's a man who heads up the 8th largest country in the world economy. But I asked him this. I said, you know, my wife and I have been thinking about you for a few years, and we've been following you because here's this young man in Spain who comes into power, and his first act of office was not an economic act or a political act. His first act of office, he announced he was going to do battle against machismo, and that it was time to end machismo in Spain. So I said to him, what would have absolutely motivated you in Spain to say your first thing as an elected official is to end machismo? And
That's
I wanted
right.
to see his answer, and he was very mindful. He said, Jeremy, it's these old hierarchical, patriarchal ways of thinking that, and the institutions that reflect them, that keep us from the kind of empathic world we want to create. And he said, so
That's great.
ultimately politics is cultural first. It's cultural first, which the feminist movement has tried to tell us for a very long time. And he said, to the extent that a younger generation is on the internet, he said, and they're in a distributed fashion, and they're sharing on an open commons, these old patriarchal, centralized, top-down ways of thinking, it doesn't register for them. So we need to begin, if we want to open up any society, we got to have these cultural discussions first. And I just thought, here's a leader. Chancellor Merkel, interesting enough, who's more quiet, is similar, even though they come from different political parties, very similar. She's very mindful. She listens for a long period of time when she's in discussions with people in a room.
Right.
And she's very, very careful to be attuned to what other folks are saying. So there are some political leaders out there like what I would say to the younger generation that's listening in is we need to believe that we have the time that's necessary, but then we have to be very steadfast and disciplined each day so that we commit our life to rehealing this planet, to establishing a new empathic frame of reference, to laying the groundwork for an empathic civilization, because life goes very quick. And one day you're 15 and the next day you're 65. So what I would say to the younger generation is this is your moment. This may be a turning point moment for history. Your generation has a tremendous, tremendous challenge. It's daunting. But you need to come to the table now and help the rest of us and help those not yet here, those yet not alive, by healing the planet, creating a new third industrial revolution economy, and beginning to create an empathic civilization for generations to come. It's a great opportunity. It's a daunting challenge.